The evening was supposed to be special. The lights sparkled, laughter echoed through the grand hall in Port Harcourt, and the scent of jollof rice and grilled fish filled the air. But Ife felt small, almost invisible, as she stood beside her husband, Chima. She smiled politely, clutching her glass tightly, even though her heart was sinking. Then, in front of their well-dressed guests, Chima said something that made her chest tighten. He laughed and said, "Ife? She's just a housewife. She doesn't bring anything to the table. No value at all." Everyone laughed, some awkwardly, some genuinely. Ife stood frozen, her smile fading. She felt the sting of humiliation burn in her chest. No one stood up for her. Not one person said, "That's not true." She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a small laugh to cover the pain. But inside, something was shifting, something deep and strong. As the music played and people clinked glasses, Eve quietly slipped away from the crowd. She found herself in the kitchen, alone, staring at her reflection in the shiny surface of the fridge. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't cry because she was weak. She cried because she was done. Done being disrespected, done being invisible. And that night, something in her heart whispered, "This will be the last time anyone laughs at me like that." The party was still going strong. Music played loudly. People danced and laughed. Glasses clinked together in cheers. But Eve couldn't hear any of it clearly anymore. Her heart was beating too fast, her throat too tight. After Chima's cruel words, she had smiled to hide her pain, but the smile was cracking. She quietly slipped away from the noisy hall and walked into the kitchen, unnoticed, like she always was. There, away from the lights and laughter, she leaned against the sink and let out a shaky breath. Her hands trembled as she wiped away the tears that had been threatening to fall. She didn't want to cry, not here, not over him, but she couldn't hold it in anymore. The words kept replaying in her head. Just a housewife, no value. She had given this man years of her life. She cooked, cleaned, raised their children, and made his life easier in every possible way. And yet, in front of everyone, he reduced her to nothing. The pain stung deeply, not just from the insult, but from the realization that this wasn't the first time. It had just never been this public. She had been shrinking for years, making herself smaller and smaller so that Chima could feel big. She had been silent, thinking that was what a good wife was supposed to do. But as she stood there in that kitchen, tears rolling silently down her cheeks, something inside her cracked, and not in a way that left her broken. It was the kind of crack that lets light in. She looked around the kitchen, a space where she had spent countless hours, feeding a family that never fully appreciated her. For a moment, she imagined a different version of herself, one where she wasn't just serving plates, but serving purpose, one where her name meant something beyond being someone's wife. The tears slowed, her breathing steadied. She wiped her face, stood taller, and looked herself in the small mirror that hung near the back door. Her eyes were red, but there was a spark in them that hadn't been there before. She didn't have all the answers, but she had made a decision. No more hiding behind curtain, no more being spoken over, no more letting someone else define her worth. Eve walked out of that kitchen with quiet strength. The party went on like nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Not out there, not yet, but inside her a storm had started. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that builds. And when it passed, the world would no longer ignore her. The morning after the party felt different. The air was quiet, but Eve's mind was loud. Chima was still asleep, snoring softly, unaware of the storm he had stirred in her heart. The children were still in bed. For the first time in a long while, Eve didn't feel numb. She felt awake, fully, truly awake. She moved through the house slowly, her thoughts heavy but clear, and then, as if led by something bigger than her, she walked into the storage room, covered in dust, and sitting quietly in a corner was her old sewing machine. It had been years since she last touched it, years since she allowed herself to even dream of designing again. Her fingers brushed over it, wiping off a layer of dust. Something about the touch felt sacred, like shaking hands with a forgotten part of herself. Her heart beat a little faster. She picked it up and carried it into the small study room. It was nothing fancy, just a quiet space with a wooden table and a chair. But to Aoife, it felt like a new beginning. She found her old sketchbook tucked away in a drawer, pages filled with designs she had drawn before marriage, before kids, before life got in the way. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to sketch again. Her hands were slow at first, uncertain, but the more she drew, the more it all came back to her. The curves, the lines, the vision. As the day went on, the house woke up. Chima walked past her without a word. The kids asked for breakfast. She cooked, cleaned, smiled. But the moment everyone was busy or asleep again, she went back to the sewing machine. That night, long after the lights went off and the house was silent, Aoife stayed up. The sound of the needle going up and down was like music to her soul. Her eyes sparkled with focus. She didn't even realize hours had passed. Fabric scraps lay all over the floor. Pins, thread, measuring tape. The room was a beautiful mess. But in the middle of it all was Aoife, alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her hands moved with purpose. Her mind buzzed with ideas. She wasn't thinking about Chima, or what he said, or what people thought. She was thinking about beauty, about creation, about the girl she used to be, and the woman she was becoming. By the time the clock struck 2 a.m., her first dress was almost done. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And as she held it up in front of her, smiling softly to herself, she whispered, "I'm not just a housewife, I'm an artist, and I'm back." A few days later, Aoife was in the middle of sewing when she heard a knock on the door. It was her neighbor, Mama Ifeoma, standing there with a shy smile and her daughter beside her. "Aoife, please," she said gently. "My daughter is graduating next week, and we can't afford a proper dress. I heard you sew. Can you help us?" Aoife looked at the young girl, her eyes full of excitement, her hands nervously clutching her phone. Something in Aoife's heart softened. She nodded without thinking twice. "Yes, I can." They didn't have money. They didn't even have fabric. But Aoife didn't mind. After they left, she went to her storage box and pulled out pieces of leftover fabric, old but still beautiful. Soft burgundy silk, a bit of lace, a strip of gold trim she had saved for years. She smiled. It would be enough. Maybe not for everyone, but enough for Aoife to make something magical. For the next few days, Aoife worked like never before. She poured every bit of her energy into that dress. She measured, cut, stitched, adjusted, and ironed. She didn't just want it to fit. She wanted the girl to feel like a queen. When the final stitch was done, she looked at it and felt something shift inside her. It was beautiful, elegant, bold, just like the woman she was becoming. The day of the graduation arrived, and the young girl wore the dress like it was made of diamonds. Her joy was contagious. She walked confidently into the ceremony, her head held high. A local photographer who was covering the event saw her, stopped in his tracks, and asked if he could take her photo. "That dress," he said, "is stunning." The picture was posted on his Instagram page that evening with the caption, "Beauty, brains, and a dress that speaks power." By the next morning, the photo had gone viral. People were flooding the comments. "Who made the dress? Where can I order one? This is pure talent." Aoife had no idea what was happening until the girl ran to her house the next day, shouting with excitement, "Auntie Aoife, you're famous!" Aoife opened her phone and saw her name being mentioned over and over again. Messages were pouring in from strangers asking for custom dresses, offering to pay. She stood in the middle of her small sewing room, phone in one hand, dress in the other, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. One dress, one chance. That's all it took. Aoife sat down slowly, her heart pounding. She wasn't just sewing anymore. She was seen. She was needed. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had value. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she created it with her own hands. The days that followed felt like a dream. Aoife's phone didn't stop buzzing. Every time she checked it, there were more messages. Some from people in Lagos, others from Ghana, and even a few from Nairobi. They had all seen the graduation dress online and wanted one just like it. "Can you make this in blue? Do you ship internationally? How soon can I get mine?" The love was pouring in, and Aoife could hardly believe it. At first, she tried to keep up with the orders on her own. She would sew during the day, cook for the family in the evening, and then go right back to the sewing machine at night. Her fingers were sore, her eyes tired, but her heart was full. She felt alive again. Every new message, every compliment, every payment alert reminded her that she was finally being seen for her talent, her hard work, her worth. But soon, it became too much for one person. The orders kept coming. People wanted wedding dresses, birthday outfits, suits, custom designs, everything. Aoife knew she had to grow, and she had to do it fast. So she made a bold decision. She turned her backyard shed into a tiny tailoring workshop. It wasn't fancy, just a wooden structure with a tin roof, a few tables, and space for sewing machines. But to Ife, it felt like a dream studio. She also knew she couldn't do this alone anymore, so she looked around her community and saw what she had once been. Young girls full of potential, but with no clear path. She called them in. One by one, they came, curious, nervous, but excited. Some were school dropouts, some were single mothers, others just searching for a chance. Eve welcomed them with open arms and said, "If you're willing to learn, I will teach you." Together they formed a team. Eve taught them how to measure, how to cut fabric with care, how to stitch with love and precision. She shared everything she knew, not just about sewing, but about standing tall, finding strength, and believing in yourself, even when no one else does. The little workshop started buzzing with life. Music played softly in the background, laughter filled the air, and the sound of sewing machines became the rhythm of hope. Orders kept coming in, and each dress that left the shop carried a piece of Ife's heart and a piece of her girls' dreams. What started with one dress was now a growing business. But more than that, it was a movement. Eve was no longer just making clothes. She was stitching together broken dreams, piece by piece, and turning them into something beautiful. At first, Chima acted like nothing had changed. He still came home with the same proud walk, dropped his keys on the table, and expected dinner to be ready. He didn't ask Aoife how her day went. He didn't mention the sewing machine. He didn't even notice the new girls coming in and out of the backyard workshop. Or maybe he did, but he chose to stay silent. After all, in his mind, she was still just a housewife. But things were changing fast, and soon, even Chima couldn't ignore it. One morning, while flipping through the newspaper at the breakfast table, he saw it, a full-page article with the headline, "From Housewife to Designer, the woman behind the viral graduation dress." Eve's photo was right there, smiling in one of her custom gowns, looking confident and beautiful. Chima's hand froze. He stared at the page longer than he should have. Then, pretending not to care, he folded it and set it aside. "They're just hyping nonsense," he mumbled under his breath. But the articles kept coming. Then came the radio interviews. One day, as he drove to work, he heard the host say, "And today, we're talking to Aoife Emanuel, the woman who's changing fashion and changing lives." Chima quickly changed the station, his face tight with anger. Everywhere he turned, her name was there. People on the street were talking about her. Church members whispered proudly, "That's Chima's wife, the famous designer." Chima didn't know what to do with the feeling growing inside him. It wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. Eve was no longer the quiet woman who waited on him hand and foot. She didn't ask him for money anymore. She didn't shrink when he walked into the room. She was busy, working, smiling, glowing. She had something he couldn't control: power, respect, independence. He started making snide remarks. "Hope you remember you still have a husband in this house," he would say. Or, "Don't let all this noise get to your head." But Aoife didn't fight. She simply smiled, nodded, and went back to her work. Her silence burned more than any argument. One evening, a package arrived at the house. It was an invitation to a business conference in Nairobi. The envelope was gold embossed, with Ife's name printed boldly on the front. Chima picked it up and stared at it for a long time. He didn't say a word. He just set it on the table and walked away. For the first time in his life, Chima felt small. His words could no longer control her. His mockery no longer broke her. And the woman he once laughed at in front of a room full of people, she was now being celebrated by the world. While he sat at home, watching it all happen, unable to stop it. One quiet evening, Ife was sitting alone in her sewing room, sorting through fabric swatches, when an email notification popped up on her phone. She opened it casually, thinking it was another dress order. But as she read the message, her hands began to tremble. She read it again, and then, again. "Congratulations, Aoife Emanuel. You have been nominated for Woman of the Year at the African Entrepreneurs Gala in Abuja." For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked around the room, filled with the humming of sewing machines and half-finished gowns, and let out a slow, stunned laugh. Her, Woman of the Year. She held the phone close to her chest and closed her eyes. It felt like a dream. like a whisper from the universe saying, "You were never small, they just couldn't see you." But instead of shouting the news from the rooftops, Eve did something unexpected. She kept it to herself. She didn't tell Chima. She didn't tell her children. Not even the young girls in her workshop knew. She tucked the email away in her heart like a fragile treasure, afraid that if she spoke it out loud, it might disappear. It wasn't that she didn't feel proud. She did, deeply. But this moment was hers, and hers alone. She wasn't ready to share it yet, not with the same people who once saw her as just a housewife. She wanted to hold it quietly, like a secret victory, the kind that heals old wounds without anyone watching. Each day after that, she walked through the house a little taller. She smiled more. Her eyes had a new glow. Even when Chima made his usual sharp remarks, they didn't cut anymore. His words bounced off her like raindrops on stone. He noticed the change, but he didn't understand it, and Aoife didn't bother to explain. She began working on a special dress late at night, a gold and cream gown with delicate beading, hand-stitched with so much care it looked like it belonged on royalty. When one of the girls asked who it was for, Eve just smiled and said, "A very important client." Inside, she was stitching more than fabric. She was sewing her story, her struggle, her strength, into every thread. This dress wasn't just for the gala. It was for every time she had been told she wasn't enough, every time she had cried behind closed doors, every time someone laughed at her dreams. When the invitation finally arrived in the mail, she placed it in her Bible, right between the pages of Psalms. And every night, before bed, she would read the words again and whisper to herself, "They finally see me." But the truth was, Eve had already seen herself, long before the world did. And now, the rest of the world was simply catching up. The night of the African Entrepreneurs Gala finally arrived, and Abuja was glowing. The city buzzed with excitement, flashing lights, luxury cars, red carpets, and the hum of journalists and photographers ready to capture greatness. It felt like another world, one Aoife never imagined she'd step into. But there she was, sitting quietly in the backseat of a black car, hands resting on her lap, wearing the gown she had poured her heart into. The dress hugged her frame like it had been sewn by the heavens. Gold and cream flowed like melted light around her, catching every glimmer from the chandelier-lit hall. Her hair was pinned back, simply, her makeup soft, her posture regal. She didn't try to be anyone else that night. She walked in as herself, Eve Emanuel, the woman they once laughed at, the woman who once cried in silence, now standing tall in her truth. As she stepped out onto the red carpet, the cameras turned. Flashes erupted like fireworks. "Who is that?" someone whispered. "That's the designer from Port Harcourt, the one with the viral dress," another replied. But Aoife didn't look left or right. She just walked, graceful, calm, certain. For the first time in her life, the world slowed down and watched her. Inside the hall, the event was grand. Chandeliers glittered, music floated through the air, and powerful people from across Africa filled the seats. Eve sat quietly at her table, surrounded by other nominees. She smiled politely, nodding at compliments. But inside her chest, her heart beat like a drum. She thought about her children at home, the girls in her workshop, the dress that started it all. And she thought, even if I don't win, I've already made it. Then the moment came. The host stepped onto the stage, opened the envelope, and said clearly into the microphone, "The Woman of the Year award goes to Aoife Emanuel." The entire hall erupted in applause. Aoife froze for a second. Tears welled in her eyes. Slowly, she stood up. Every step to that stage felt like a journey through her past. The insults, the loneliness, the late nights sewing by candlelight. But now she walked with pride, her gown flowing behind her like a crown of light. As she reached the stage and took the award in her hands, the cameras zoomed in, and for a second, the entire continent was watching her. Not because of her husband, not because of pity, but because she had earned this moment. She looked into the crowd, not with fear, but with quiet power, and smiled. And somewhere far away, in a living room back in Port Harcourt, Chima sat in silence, staring at the TV screen. The woman he once called useless was now being cheered by presidents, CEOs, and leaders from all over Africa. It wasn't just a night of celebration. It was a night of justice. Aoife didn't just win an award. She claimed her voice, her worth, and her place in the world, and nothing would ever take that away from her again. Aoife stood at the microphone, her hands gently resting on the glass podium. the golden award still warm in her fingers. The lights above shone bright, but she didn't blink. She looked out at the sea of faces, powerful women, respected men, leaders, dreamers, strangers, all waiting to hear what she would say. Her heart was pounding, but her voice, when it came, was calm and clear. "I was told I was useless," she began. The room went still. Her voice didn't shake. It was soft, but full of something stronger than volume. Truth. "I was told I had no value, that I was just a housewife, that my place was in the background, quiet and small." People leaned forward in their seats. No one touched their drinks. No one moved. But the same hands they mocked. She held up her fingers, the ones once burned from hot iron, the ones that had stitched through tears. Those hands built something. They built dresses, then dreams, and eventually an empire. There was a gasp, then silence again. She paused, her eyes beginning to shimmer with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I didn't have a degree. I didn't have money. I didn't even have support. All I had was pain and a sewing machine." A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd, not in mockery but in awe. She went on, her voice growing stronger. "There are women sitting in rooms right now believing they're invisible. Women who have been made to feel like they don't matter because they don't have a title or a paycheck or someone clapping for them. This award, this moment, it's not just mine. It's for every woman who's been silenced, ignored, laughed at, but kept going anyway." A few people in the audience wiped their eyes. Even the camera crew looked shaken. Eve smiled gently, her strength quiet but undeniable. "To the women who feel stuck, I want you to hear me. Your story is not over. Your value is not measured by someone else's opinion. And your power, it's waiting inside you. You just have to choose to use it." There was a beat of stillness, like the whole room took one shared breath. Then the applause began. At first, soft, then louder. Then it became a standing ovation. The entire hall rose to its feet, clapping not just for Eve, but for every woman she spoke for. And miles away, in a living room in Port Harcourt, Chima stared at the TV screen. He didn't move. The remote slipped from his hand and hit the floor. He watched as the woman he once dismissed, once mocked in front of friends, now stood taller than he'd ever seen her. He saw the crowd cheering, saw the pride on her face, heard the power in her voice. And for the first time in his life, Chima was truly silent, because deep down, he knew the world had finally seen Eve, and she would never be unseen again. After the award night, Aoife's life changed even more, not just in big ways, but in deeply personal ones. She wasn't just a fashion designer anymore. She had become a voice, a symbol of strength for women everywhere, and she knew she had to do more. So, with quiet determination, Aoife opened a foundation for women trapped in abusive marriages, women who, like her, had once believed they had no way out. She called it the second stitch, because just like in sewing, sometimes life needs a second thread to hold it together. The foundation offered shelter, legal help, therapy, and even tailoring training. Every woman who walked through those doors felt like they were being seen for the first time. Eve sat with them, listened to them, hugged them. She didn't speak as a celebrity. She spoke as one of them. Her story spread even further. News outlets, blogs, talk shows. Everyone wanted to talk to her. And then, one day, a message came from Netflix. They wanted to tell her story to the world, not just as a fashion success, but as a woman who rose from humiliation and pain to build something powerful. The documentary was called The Dressmaker's Revenge. When it aired, millions watched it, and millions cried. Funny enough, the same guests who once laughed at her at that party in Port Harcourt. They now sent her long messages, asking for interviews, collaborations, or just to catch up. Eve smiled politely, but her heart had moved on. She was no longer trying to prove her worth to anyone. She was too busy helping others discover theirs.